There exists a peculiar phenomenon in modern society that has intrigued psychologists, sociologists, and philosophers for decades: the inexplicable disappearance of individuals from the social fabric of their lives. Not a physical vanishing, though sometimes that occurs, but rather a psychological withdrawal so profound that people who once maintained vibrant social connections suddenly become invisible to their networks. They ghost friends, abandon relationships, silence their phones, and retreat into self-imposed isolation. The question that haunts researchers and concerned loved ones alike is deceptively simple on the surface, but profoundly complex in its depths. Why do some people disappear from everyone? The answer to this question intertwines with one of the most transformative and controversial philosophies of self-development: the concept that the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. This seemingly paradoxical statement holds the key to understanding not just why people disappear, but perhaps more importantly, who they become when they do. To explore this intersection is to journey into the psychological landscape where vulnerability meets strength, where pain becomes catalyst, and where disappearance can be either a symptom of crisis or the birth of transformation. Part 1. The Architecture of Disappearance: Understanding the Psychology Behind Human Withdrawal. When Marcus received his promotion at the consulting firm, everyone expected him to celebrate with his colleagues. The group had spent countless evenings at the same wine bar, shared inside jokes that spanned years, and maintained the kind of friendship that seemed unshakable. Yet within weeks of his advancement, Marcus's responses to invitations became slower. His texts grew shorter. Eventually, he stopped opening messages altogether. His friends were bewildered. They called his apartment, left voicemails, and attempted interventions. But Marcus had already begun his metamorphosis. He wasn't avoiding them out of cruelty or even conscious choice. He was undergoing a psychological dissolution of his former self. This pattern repeats across countless individuals and manifests in psychological literature under various diagnostic frameworks. The disappearance of certain people from social life is not a single phenomenon, but rather a convergence of psychological processes, each compelling individuals toward withdrawal, with different intensities and durations. Understanding this requires moving beyond judgment and entering into the sophisticated architecture of human psychology. The first layer of this architecture involves what psychologists term identity fragmentation. Every human being carries within themselves multiple selves: the self presented to parents, the self revealed to intimate partners, the self displayed in professional environments, and the inner self that exists only in solitude. These various versions of self are not pathological in their multiplicity, they are adaptive. However, certain life transitions create acute awareness of the distance between these selves. When an individual begins to recognize the profound disconnect between who they have been presenting themselves as and who they authentically are, the psychological discomfort becomes intolerable. Consider Sarah, who spent 15 years cultivating the identity of an adventurous extrovert among her friend group. She was the one who organized trips, hosted parties, and maintained the social calendar with meticulous attention. Yet internally, she was exhausted. The performance consumed her psychological resources daily. She experienced anxiety before social gatherings, felt isolated even in crowds, and found herself mentally absent during conversations she had initiated. Her online presence was curated and bright. Her internal reality was dark and depleted. This divergence doesn't arise from deception or inherent dishonesty, but from the deeply human attempt to be acceptable, to belong, to be loved for the person others needed her to be, rather than for who she actually was. The psychological research on this phenomenon reveals something crucial. The distance between the public self and the authentic self creates what researchers call identity burden. This burden accumulates over time like compound interest on emotional debt. The person becomes increasingly aware that maintaining their social relationships requires the constant expenditure of psychic energy toward performance. They recognized that if they were truly honest about their thoughts, feelings, and needs, they would lose their position in the social hierarchy. This creates a bind where continuing feels impossible, yet leaving feels like death. This bind generates a second layer in the architecture of disappearance: the emergence of what might be called protective nihilism. As the burden grows unbearable, individuals begin to withdraw the emotional investment they've placed in their relationships. They stop returning calls not from malice but from an increasing difficulty in caring about the consequences. The friendship that once felt vital becomes reframed as superficial. The group that once provided belonging now appears as a collective hallucination of sameness. The person experiencing this transformation begins to see their entire social life through a lens of futility. Psychologically, this is not mere depression, though depression may accompany it. It is a more targeted withdrawal of emotional cathexes from specific relationships and social roles. The person begins to reclaim the psychological resources they've invested in maintaining these connections. As they do, they feel simultaneously relieved and devastated. Relieved because they're no longer performing. Devastated because they recognize that the relationships they're abandoning were built on false foundations. The third layer involves what attachment theorists recognize as the reorientation of internal working models. An internal working model is the unconscious system through which we evaluate relationships and predict others' responses to us. When someone becomes aware that their relationships are predicated on a false presentation of self, their internal working model becomes destabilized. They find themselves questioning not just their current friendships, but their capacity to form genuine connections at all. This questioning often leads to a hypothesis that feels revelatory, but is actually destructive. Perhaps I cannot be loved for who I truly am. Therefore, perhaps it's better to love no one and need no one. This hypothesis drives them further from their social world. They begin to interpret neutral social interactions through a paranoid lens. A friend's minor comment about their behavior becomes evidence of judgment. A slight delay in a text response becomes confirmation of rejection. The person spinning into withdrawal begins to construct a psychological narrative in which their disappearance is not a choice but an inevitable recognition of a harsh truth. They don't truly belong anywhere. The neurobiological dimension of this withdrawal cannot be ignored. When individuals are under sustained psychological stress, their nervous systems become dysregulated. The prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for rational decision-making and impulse control, becomes less active, while the amygdala and threat detection systems become hyperactive. In this state, social interaction feels dangerous. The person's nervous system is literally interpreting social connection as a threat. Their body is flooding with cortisol and adrenaline when they contemplate reaching out to friends. From this neurobiological perspective, withdrawal is not a character flaw but a survival mechanism the body has activated to protect itself. Moreover, there exists a peculiar psychological phenomenon researchers have termed the withdrawal momentum effect. As a person begins to withdraw from social life, each day of non-contact becomes progressively easier. The anxiety about reconnection diminishes with time, replaced by something more dangerous: familiarity with solitude. The isolated state becomes normalized. The disappeared person no longer experiences their absence as a crisis. Instead, they experience re-entry into social life as the actual crisis. They've adapted to isolation so thoroughly that the prospect of explaining their absence, facing disappointment, or returning to performance feels impossible. Additionally, the disappearance often correlates with what psychologists call a values reorientation. They recognize that their friendships may have been built on mutual consumption of entertainment, shared materialism, or the need for social status. These friendships they begin to feel are actually impediments to their becoming who they need to become. The relationships must be severed not because the people are bad, but because the entire structure has become a cage. This reorientation often coincides with a period of what we might call involuntary introspection. Cut off from external stimulation and social distraction, the person is forced to encounter themselves. And here is where the disappearance transitions from being purely pathological into something more complex, the territory where destruction and creation become indistinguishable. The psychology of disappearance is not simply the psychology of running away. It is, in many cases, the psychology of running towards something essential. The person who withdraws completely from their social world often does so because they have begun to recognize, however inchoately, that they are not sustainable in their current form. They are experiencing, at a psychological level, what the biologist calls phase transition, a fundamental reorganization of structure. A caterpillar doesn't simply decide to stop being a caterpillar. It must dissolve into the chrysalis entirely. It must become, temporarily, nothing. Only then can the butterfly emerge. Part 2. The dissolution and reconstruction. When weakness must die to strength can be born. The second phase of this psychological journey involves a counterintuitive movement. The person who has disappeared doesn't simply remain disappeared. Instead, they enter into what might be described as a period of intensive self-deconstruction, a psychological demolition project that is both necessary and perilous. This is the experiential reality behind the principle that, The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. To understand this principle, we must first clarify what weak self means. It does not refer to kindness, empathy, or moral virtue. The weak self is not weakness in the sense of fragility or gentleness. Rather, the weak self refers to the identity structure that is dependent on external validation, that derives its sense of worth from others' approval, that is constantly shaped and reshaped by the perceived judgments of the social world. The weak self is the self that cannot stand alone because it was never built to stand at all. It was built to lean. James was 32 when his wife left him. The marriage had appeared successful from the outside. The house, the vacations, the carefully curated social media presence, but the truth was that James had constructed his entire identity around being a good husband, a provider, a man who was doing it right. When his wife announced that she had never been happy, that she felt more alone in the marriage than she had ever felt, James's entire structure collapsed. The external validator had withdrawn approval, and James discovered that he had nothing internal holding him together. In the weeks that followed, James experienced what might seem like a mental breakdown. He stopped going to work. He didn't respond to concerned friends. He sat in his apartment in a state of apparent depression. But something was actually happening beneath the surface. Freed from the necessity of performing for his wife, James was encountering himself for the first time in years, and what he discovered was shocking. He didn't know himself at all. He didn't know what he actually enjoyed, what he actually believed, what he actually wanted from life. He had spent his entire adult years being the person others needed him to be. This discovery is the critical juncture at which disappearance can transition into transformation. The person must now face a terrifying emptiness. They must confront the fact that the self they believed to be strong and stable was actually a construction, a performance, elaborate disguise. This confrontation is not merely intellectually interesting. It is psychologically devastating. It is a small death. And for it to lead to actual transformation, the person must not rush out of this emptiness. They must remain in it long enough to let it remake them fundamentally. The psychologist Carl Rogers described this process as the dissolution of conditions of worth. In childhood, most humans learn that they are worthy of love and acceptance only insofar as they meet the conditions imposed by their caregivers. Be quiet, be good, be successful, be what your parents need you to be, and you will receive love. Don't meet these conditions, and you will be rejected. Over a lifetime, these conditions of worth embed themselves so deeply in the psyche that people stop experiencing them as external impositions and start experiencing them as internal truths. They genuinely believe that they are only worthy if they perform well, if they're liked, if they succeed. The person who disappears and enters into the reconstruction phase is, in many cases, unconsciously beginning to dismantle these conditions of worth. They're engaging in what we might call radical reorientation of value. They're beginning to operate from a different fundamental premise, that they possess worth that is not contingent on external approval, that they don't need to earn their place in the world through performance, that there is something about themselves that is valuable precisely because it is theirs, not because anyone else has validated it.
This reconstruction phase is marked by a kind of psychological asceticism.
The person strips away the external markers they use to define themselves. They may stop caring about their appearance, may abandon career ambitions, may reject the social status they once pursued relentlessly. To observers, this appears as deterioration. To the person themselves, it might actually feel like liberation, even as it feels terrifying. Consider Elena, who had spent a decade building a successful career in finance. She was respected, well compensated, and envied by her peers. Yet the work had become her entire identity. She had organized her life entirely around professional success. When she began to question whether this was actually the life she wanted to be living, the questioning spiraled into a complete rejection of everything she had built. She quit her job abruptly, moved to a different city where she knew no one, and took a minimum wage position working in a bookstore. Her family was horrified. Her former colleagues thought she was having a psychological crisis, but Aileen experienced something different. For the first time in years, she felt real. She was neither pursuing nor maintaining anything for external validation. She was simply working and living and reading and walking and existing. The stripping away of her professional identity felt like the removal of an armor that had been cutting off her circulation. Yes, it left her exposed, but it also allowed her to breathe. The psychological principle at work here is what Jungian analysts call enantiodromia, the emergence of the opposite. When a person has identified completely with one aspect of themselves, the psyche naturally generates pressure toward its opposite. The overachiever becomes the person who stops trying. The people pleaser becomes the person who withdraws completely. The extrovert becomes the hermit. This isn't pathology. It's the psyche's attempt to rebalance itself. The destruction of the weak self is inherently a destruction of the strategies and structures that allowed the weak self to exist. It requires abandoning the behaviors, relationships, and belief systems that were holding the false self together. It requires being willing to lose everything you built on the foundation of seeking others' approval, knowing that if you don't, you'll spend the rest of your life exhausted by the maintenance work. Neuroscientifically, this process involves something called neural reorganization. When a person repeatedly engages in different behaviors, in this case the behavior of standing alone without the support of their social network, their brain physically reorganizes itself. Neural pathways form. The parts of the brain associated with self-judgment and social anxiety begin to quieten as other parts associated with introspection and self-directed motivation activate. This isn't poetic metaphor. This is measurable neurological change. The reconstruction phase typically involves periods of what might be called voluntary suffering or productive struggle. The person deliberately confronts the thoughts and feelings they previously avoided. They sit with the anxiety of existing without external validation. They experience the deep loneliness of being truly unknown. They face the grief of realizing that relationships they cherished were often shallow or one-sided. They grieve the time and energy they spent being someone they didn't actually want to be. This period is where the weak self is truly destroyed. It's destroyed through deliberate non-engagement with the systems that sustained it. The person stops seeking validation, so the mechanism through which validation normally arrives becomes defunct. The person stops performing, so the reward system that reinforced performance collapses. The person stops relying on external relationships for a sense of identity, so the relationships that were predicated on that dependency become unbearable to maintain. The weak self, the self that could only exist in relation to others' approval, is systematically starved of the resources it needed to survive. What emerges from this destruction is what we might call the authentic core. This is not a permanent, fixed thing, but rather a capacity. The capacity to exist without needing others to tell you that you're okay. The capacity to make decisions based on your own values rather than others' expectations. The capacity to be alone without feeling annihilated. The person who emerges from this crucible has undergone something more fundamental than personal growth. They have undergone a transformation in their very structure. The transformation is marked by a peculiar freedom. Once you have destroyed the self that was dependent on others' approval, you become essentially invulnerable to external attack. If someone criticizes you, it doesn't strike at the core of your being because your sense of self is no longer predicated on their good opinion. If you lose a relationship while you may grieve, you're not annihilated because your identity wasn't built upon that relationship. If you experience failure, while it may be disappointing, it doesn't destroy you because you don't believe you are only worthy if you succeed. This doesn't mean the transformed person becomes invulnerable in a dangerous sense, immune to empathy or connection. Rather, they become invulnerable in the only way that matters. They can be destroyed by circumstances, by illness, by loss, but they cannot be destroyed by others' judgments or rejection. There is a core of self that is self-sustaining, self-directed, self-validating. It is from this understanding that the principle emerges. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. Part 3. Emergence and Integration. The return from disappearance and the reconstructed self. The third and often overlooked phase of the disappearance cycle is what happens after the destruction and reconstruction is sufficient. Most narratives about people who withdraw from society end in one of two ways. Either they remain withdrawn, becoming increasingly isolated and bitter, or they are forcibly extracted by concerned loved ones and integrated back into their previous social structures. But there is a third possibility, and it is the most psychologically interesting. The person who has completed a thorough enough transformation emerges into a new form of engagement with the world. This emergence is not a simple reversal of the disappearance. The person does not return to their previous relationships or social structures. Rather, they return to the world transformed in ways that are often barely recognizable to those who knew them before. They come back to engagement from a completely different psychological foundation. And in doing so, they often become more genuinely connected, more deeply valuable to others, and paradoxically more capable of true intimacy than they were in their previous life of performance. David's friends first noticed something was different when he reappeared in their social circle. It had been 16 months since they'd seen him. In that time, he had moved away, worked several different jobs, traveled alone to countries where he knew no one, and spent weeks simply sitting in parks, observing and thinking. He looked different, thinner, less polished, with a beard and weathered skin. But what struck people most was his presence. When he spoke, it was with less urgency. When he listened, it was with genuine attention rather than the constant mental calculation of how his participation was being perceived. He was less entertaining but somehow more compelling. He was comfortable with silence in a way he never had been before. The change in David was not immediately appealing to everyone. Some of his previous friends felt his withdrawal had been selfish and didn't appreciate his new detachment from their social dramas. Others found him less fun, less willing to participate in the shallow entertainment they had once shared. But those who had the capacity for deeper connection found themselves drawn to him in new ways. He had something that cannot be performed. The authenticity of someone who has already lost everything they needed to lose and therefore had nothing to prove. This psychological transformation manifests in several key ways. The first is what might be called radical authenticity. The person who has destroyed their weak self no longer has the capacity or the inclination to maintain false presentations. This doesn't mean they become rude or inappropriately revealing. Rather, it means that they are no longer in the exhausting business of managing others' impressions. They respond rather than perform. They speak truth rather than craft sentences designed to elicit particular reactions. This authenticity is profoundly attractive at a psychological level, even if it's sometimes uncomfortable. Humans are desperately hungry for genuine connection. We live in a world of careful presentation and managed personas. Most interactions feel transactional. When someone arrives in that world genuinely themselves, not because they're being provocative, but because they're no longer willing to be anything else, it creates a kind of gravitational pull. People are drawn to authenticity like plants to sunlight. The second manifestation is what we might call compassionate detachment. The person who has been through the crucible of disappearance and reconstruction develops a different relationship to others suffering in difficulties. They've been through enough psychological pain that they develop a kind of wisdom about it. They can be present with others' difficulties without needing to fix them, without needing to perform the role of the helpful friend. They can listen without the constant mental chatter of how the story relates to them. This capacity for what is sometimes called differential empathy, empathy that is not contingent on identifying with someone else's experience, is extremely rare and extremely valuable. Moreover, they often develop what might be called healthy boundaries, but this term doesn't quite capture it. They have moved beyond the anxious need to maintain relationships at any cost. They have also moved beyond the reactionary coldness of someone determined to protect themselves. Instead, they have developed a kind of clear-sighted understanding of what relationships are actually serving their development and what relationships are drains on their energy. They participate in relationships from a position of choice rather than compulsion. Mira had been part of a friend group for 12 years before she disappeared. The group had been important to her, but in truth, she had been carrying most of the emotional labor. She was the one who kept everyone connected, who organized gatherings, who listened to others' problems, who was always available. When she withdrew, people were genuinely hurt. Some tried to pull her back. Others felt abandoned and became angry. But when she finally reintegrated into social life, it was on completely different terms. She still maintained some of these friendships, but only those in which there was genuine reciprocity. She was no longer willing to be the emotional workhorse of her social circle. She attended gatherings when she felt like going, not out of obligation. She was honest when she was tired or didn't want to talk. She declined invitations without guilt or explanation. To some of her friends, this appeared cold. To others, it was a relief, and actually made the friendship feel more genuine for the first time. Because now if Mira showed up, it was because she genuinely wanted to be there. Her presence was a choice, not a compulsion. The third manifestation is what might be called purposeful engagement. The person who has been through the transformation often finds that their values have shifted fundamentally. They're less interested in status, less interested in consumption and accumulation, less interested in being impressive. They often become interested in things that actually matter to them. creative pursuits, service to others, learning, nature, or various forms of meaning-making. They engage with the world from a place of genuine interest rather than anxiety about performance. This can manifest in dramatic ways: career changes, geographical relocations, complete lifestyle shifts. Or it can manifest quietly, in a gradual reorientation of how time is spent and energy is allocated. But in nearly all cases, there is a marked shift from doing things to be someone toward doing things because they matter. The psychological research on post-traumatic growth provides some framework for understanding what's happening at this stage. When people go through significant psychological difficulty, and the disappearance and reconstruction phase is certainly that, they often don't simply return to their baseline. Instead, they sometimes undergo genuine transformation. They develop what researchers call post-traumatic growth, which includes increased personal strength, deeper appreciation for life, improved relationships, spiritual or philosophical change, and the identification of new possibilities. The irony is exquisite. The person who disappeared from everyone, who to all external appearances had a breakdown, often emerges with a quality of presence and authenticity that actually improves their capacity for real connection. They are no longer hungry for approval, so they can genuinely appreciate others without needing them to validate their existence. They are no longer anxious about their social position, so they can be genuinely helpful to others without the ulterior motive of maintaining status. They are no longer performing, so they can be surprised by genuine connection rather than constantly evaluating how well they're being received. There is also a deeper integration that occurs at this stage. The person is no longer fighting against themselves. The weak self that was dependent on others' approval has been destroyed thoroughly enough that there's nothing left to defend against. They've accepted the parts of themselves they once hated and rejected. They've grieved the loss of the false self they spent years constructing. They've integrated the wisdom that came from their time in the wilderness. The internal civil war, which had been raging for so long that it felt like their natural state, begins to quiet. Furthermore, the person who has gone through this cycle often becomes a kind of guide for others who are suffering in similar ways. They recognize the signs of the crisis, the false self breaking down, the unbearable burden of performance. They can offer something invaluable: the knowledge that someone else has been through it and come out the other side. They can model what a human being looks like who has stopped trying to be anyone other than themselves. They can show that while the process of disappearance and reconstruction is painful, the alternative, spending your entire life maintaining a false self, is actually the greater tragedy. The return from disappearance, then, is not a return to the previous state. It is an arrival in a new state entirely. The person comes back to engagement with the world as someone fundamentally different. They are less impressive on the surface, often, but more genuinely impressive in the ways that matter. They are less entertaining, but more interesting. They are less invested in being liked, but more often deeply valued. They have lost the weak self, and in doing so, have become something that cannot be destroyed by others. In the final analysis, the psychology of disappearance reveals something profound about human development. The common narrative tells us that growth happens through accumulation, acquiring skills, relationships, status, accomplishments. But the deepest transformations often require the opposite: a period of stripping away, a darkness where you lose everything you thought you needed, a wilderness where you must learn to exist without external validation. The person who disappears from everyone often does so because they have begun, consciously or unconsciously, the work of destroying the self that cannot survive on its own. They are dismantling the structure that was built entirely on others' approval. And while this disappearance looks like breakdown from the outside, from the inside it is often a kind of breakthrough, the necessary death that precedes resurrection. Those who emerge from this cycle genuinely intact are not those who escape back into performance, who find new social groups to validate their existence, who simply trade one form of false self for another. They are those who stayed in the wilderness long enough to let the false structures decompose entirely. They are those who allowed themselves to be nothing, to have no role, no status, no impressive story, until a genuine self could crystallize around their actual values and actual nature. And the result is a human being who is, paradoxically, both alone and deeply connected. They are alone in the sense that they do not need others to complete them. They are deeply connected in that their relationships are no longer transactions in the economy of approval, but genuine encounters between people who are choosing to be present with one another. They have destroyed the weak self, and in doing so have become something that no external force can destroy. This is the terrible, beautiful promise of the disappearance cycle. that sometimes the only way to become unbreakable is to first allow yourself to completely break.